Mr. President, as you know, last Friday, the Senate swore in new leaders for the 119th Congress. And in 2 weeks, the new commander-in-chief will be sworn in for a second time. We are 6 days into a new year, and people around the country are making resolutions for the new year, from everything from health to fitness, books to read, financial goals to meet. And as Republicans, now is a good time for us to do the exact same thing. We have our work cut out for us to help clean up the mess that President Biden and Senate Democrats have left us from the last 4 years. I believe our first and most urgent task is to confirm President Trump's nominees for his cabinet. The president won the election, and he's entitled to his team, absent extraordinary circumstances. It's simply impossible for the new administration to tackle the mountain of work waiting for them without their team of advisors who will lead critical government agencies. Without the president's cabinet in place, he cannot get the job done that he was elected to do on November the 5th. With his cabinet in place, we can get to work to implement the agenda that Texans and Americans across the country elected a trifecta of Republican leaders to accomplish. The top of our list of priorities is, of course, to secure the southern border. I represent a state with 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico. And sadly and tragically, under the previous administration's open border policies, it has been an unmitigated disaster. The crisis at the southern border is one that President Biden quite literally invited with his campaign rhetoric and with his administration's policies. He invited this crisis. This was perhaps the one campaign promise that he delivered on. The Biden administration set out to reverse many, if not all, of President Trump's policies from his first term, including the Remain in Mexico policy and Title 42. Under President Biden's watch, the Border Patrol are overwhelmed with record numbers of illegal migrants crossing the border. Border Patrol encountered more than 370 people on the terror watch list crossing between ports of entry during the Biden administration. We know there were roughly a dozen people who were part of the conspiracy that resulted in the death of 3,000 Americans on September the 11th, 2001. And now here we have 370 people on the terror watch list that crossed between ports of entry during the Biden administration. Well, that compares with well under 10 years under the Trump administration. But I think the point is pretty obvious. This is dangerous. And those are only the aliens who the Border Patrol encountered or apprehended. Remember that President Biden also set records for gotaways. That's what the Border Patrol calls the people who've simply evaded law enforcement. Aliens who fled because, frankly, they were up to no good. As of May, more than 1.7 million gotaways had made their ways into the United States under their watch. And these are just people who triggered various cameras and sensors and were able to evade law enforcement. Surely there were more that were able to make their way into the interior of the United States. Again, under President Biden's border policies, all you have to do is turn yourself in and you would be released into the interior. But these are people that could not even risk that because of either their criminal records or their intentions to do harm, including carry drugs into the United States. Since the Biden administration established the word asylum as a magic word that resulted in your release in the interior, we can be pretty sure that many of those evading Border Patrol have something else to hide. Human trafficking and drug trafficking by the cartels have caused enormous and often untold suffering for the people of my home state of Texas and Americans as a whole. Fentanyl, which is now the leading cause of death of young people in America, 18 to 45, is manufactured, or the precursors are manufactured in China and trafficked through the U.S.-Mexico border. Countless migrants released into the interior of our country have failed to show up for their day in court, showing others looking to make the dangerous journey to the United States that they might also be able to make it and suffer zero consequences. All of these actions, or lack of actions from the Biden administration, have sent a clear signal that the laws of the United States will not be enforced. You know, law enforcement depends on our great men and women in blue to investigate crimes and to deter other people from committing crimes. But deterrence is a very important element that has simply been lost by the Biden administration's open border policies. Given the fact that most people who come to the United States know under the Biden administration that you'll simply be released, there's no reason for them to believe that they will not be released as well, and so there is zero deterrence. That is getting ready to change under President Trump. Madam President.
Senator from Texas.
Madam President, last week I had a chance to lay out some of my top priorities for the new Congress as Republicans take the helm. Today I want to elaborate on the first of those priorities, which is to confirm President Trump's cabinet. Back in November the 5th, it seems like a long time ago, but it was just the other day, Americans went to the polls to elect new leaders, including a president of the United States. Voters made their voices heard as to which direction our country should go because they plainly believed that we were heading in the wrong direction. And as a result of that vote, President Trump won the election decisively. Now, from my perspective, that means he is entitled to his team, absent some extraordinary circumstances, because it's his team or cabinet that will help him follow through on the promises that he made on the campaign trail. Once confirmed, these men and women will then be accountable to him and the American people to accomplish the goals that he has set out for them. That's the way the process is supposed to work. Now, Madam President, if you remember back in 2017, during President Trump's first term, this process was not what you might call smooth sailing. In fact, Senate Democrats did everything they could to delay and derail the president's cabinet. They did so openly, without shame or any embarrassment. In fact, when Senate Minority Leader at the time was asked in an interview back in 2017 if he would attempt to keep Justice Scalia's seat open rather than work with Republicans to confirm a Republican president's nominee, he said, absolutely. Well, it's funny how history works and how things work out, but of course, Democrats went on to criticize Republicans for doing exactly the same thing that Senator Schumer said he would do if the shoe were on the other foot. It was an embarrassing moment, or should have been an embarrassing moment for the Democratic Minority Leader. He sent a clear message to all of us that he was willing to put partisanship ahead of the country and before the voices of the American people who voted for President Trump could be heard. If Democrats repeat the same play this year, they will only further embarrass themselves and the party and be a disservice to the American people who elected President Trump and J.D. Vance on November the 5th. So I would like to caution my colleagues, my Democratic colleagues, not to play the same shenanigans again. But unfortunately, it looks like they've come up with a new tactic. The delays we're already starting to see in the confirmation process are completely unacceptable. We know when President Trump will be sworn in, that's January the 20th, and we need to make sure that as many members of his cabinet, particularly his national security cabinet, are available to be confirmed when President Trump takes his hand off the Bible. Just 2 days ago, Axios News reported some interesting details, for example, surrounding the Democrats' handling of the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard, President Trump's choice to be Director of National Intelligence. According to this report, Democrats on the Senate Intelligence Committee are refusing to work as a team with Republicans to schedule her hearing, citing concerns that her background checks are not yet completed. Now, this is unacceptable. According to Axios, Ms. Gabbard has submitted all of the paperwork required on her end as part of the background check process. And this is someone who serves currently as a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard. It's a former member of Congress, somebody who's been thoroughly vetted for security purposes. But it is up to the Biden administration, because they currently hold office, including all parts of the executive branch, including the Department of Justice and the FBI. It's up to them to make sure the paperwork is expedited so Ms. Gabbard can have her hearing and presumably, if confirmed, be available to serve on day one after President Trump is sworn into office. So the FBI needs to work 24/7, not we'll get around to it when we can. They need to work 24/7 to get these background checks done before the nomination hearings. And so the hearings can actually be set. We know that if there's the will to get it done, that it can be done. And in my view, it must be done. If Democrats are so concerned that the Senate does not yet have her background check, then the President Biden, should direct those concerns, should address those concerns by making sure that his FBI and his Department of Justice get the background checks done, because they are still technically in charge until January the 20th. There's nothing the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, can do officially to make that happen. It's up to President Biden and his FBI and his Department of Justice. By slow-walking her background check and causing delays for such a critical appointment, the Biden administration is posing a threat, an unnecessary threat to our national security. We all know we're living in a dangerous world, and now is not the time to have some prolonged and unnecessary vacancy for the Director of National Intelligence. So I would hope our Democratic colleagues and the administration, the current administration, would abandon this futile and dangerous tactic. As other nominees are working to complete their requisite paperwork, I would urge the Biden administration to work with the incoming administration, not against the administration, to expedite this process. They talk about a peaceful transfer of power. Well, that's what this includes. This is part of that peaceful transfer of power from one administration to the next. Democrats have a duty and a responsibility to set aside any partisan tactics and to give the president an opportunity to have his cabinet confirmed. Just imagine how Democrats and even the mainstream media would respond if an outgoing Republican administration intentionally caused delays for crucial appointments after voters gave them a mandate. They would claim this is a threat to our nation's security. Republicans would be accused of playing games and playing politics with critical government agencies. And of course, their favorite pet accusation, Democrats would undoubtedly call these tactics a threat to democracy. Well, with the shoe on the other foot, the situation is no different. Back in 2015, the senator from Michigan, Senator Stabenow, said, quote, "When a president wins an election, they have a right to their team." That's exactly how we should understand this process. President Trump was elected, and he has a right to his team. Again, this doesn't mean that the Senate will rubber stamp any nominee. That's what advice and consent is all about. The background checks, the hearings, like we see this morning with the Secretary of Defense nominee, Mr. Hegseth. This means committees must hold hearings and votes for each of the president's nominees. It's that simple. And of course, Democrats have every opportunity during these hearings to ask any questions that they want and to vote however they want. We're not saying their rights should somehow be constricted, but to deny and delay the hearings outright is simply unconscionable and dangerous. Democrats are not entitled to sabotage this president by denying him his cabinet. Any efforts to do so undermines the democratic process and that peaceful transfer of power that we hear so much about and which is so important. Senate Republicans, Senate Democrats, and the outgoing Biden administration alike must act in the best interest of the country, not in their party's best interest, not in pursuit of some partisan agenda, but in the best interest of the country. And it is far from America's best interest to have President Trump sitting alone at the White House, maybe with the vice president, and no cabinet there to support him in his efforts. President Biden should remember that people around the country and around the world will be watching very closely his final days in office. Unfortunately, his administration has already been marked by a multitude of failed policies and scandals. President Biden would be wise to note that the handling of the transition at the end of his term can, if mishandled, further tarnish his administration's reputation. History will not be forgiving if his outgoing administration decides to threaten the safety and security of the American people by causing unnecessary delays for cabinet appointments, particularly his national security cabinet. The American people elected President Trump as the next leader of our country. Now it's the time for the Senate to do our job by making sure that the president has the team he needs to do that job. And I intend to do everything I can to see that his nominees are confirmed on a timely basis. Madam President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, it's 4 days until President Trump will be inaugurated for the second time as President of the United States. That means we only have 4 more days of President Biden's absentee leadership. But he seems to be making the most of his final days as he goes out the door, and he certainly isn't letting it kick him on the way out. I think the most egregious example of the abuse of power, really, that President Biden is engaged in now that the election's over and he doesn't have to stand for a vote among the American people, so he pretty much has given him a thumb in the eye. Perhaps one of the most egregious examples of this was his pardon of his son Hunter on December the 1st of last year. Despite numerous efforts by the FBI and DOJ to protect Hunter Biden for the accountability for his crimes, President Biden decided to attack his own Department of Justice and say his son was selectively and unfairly prosecuted. Well, it's hard to imagine someone thinking they were unfairly targeted when entire government agencies did everything they could to protect him from coming to justice. And thanks to a diligent and careful judge who was able to expose a sweetheart deal that would have exonerated Hunter Biden previously. So he was convicted of illegally possessing a firearm, and he stood charged with massive tax fraud. President Biden said time and time again, "I promise I'm not going to pardon him." And then he turned around and he did. But he didn't stop there. He used his last days of office to go on a little pardon spree, granting clemency to 39 individuals, as well as commuting the sentences of convicted murderers on death row. These people were convicted of crimes ranging from conspiracy to commit wire fraud to, in a mortgage fraud scheme, to stealing government property, to signing false documents, bank theft, participating in income tax fraud, and a misuse of a Social Security number. But the truth is, these are not victimless crimes, and they're not the sort of occurrences we want to see happening more frequently. There's a reason why our criminal justice system provides for accountability and punishment in appropriate circumstances. That's to set an example for others not to go down that path and to have some measure of accountability, which is an important part of justice. These sentenced criminals were not the only people that got a last-minute gift from President Biden. On January 4th, President Biden announced a list of 19 new recipients of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. This included George Soros and others. George Soros, of course, is a billionaire philanthropist who's doled out billions of dollars to left-wing political causes, from defund the police movements to anti-Israel organizations, to those who promote open borders, such as we have experienced tragically over the last 4 years. Of course, these are the same policies that have caused so much suffering and frustration among the American people, which they voted on. I believe it was a referendum on November the 5th, voted to change the direction the country was headed in, because most Americans, according to public opinion polling, felt like America was on the wrong path and needed a change of course. And now a key architect of those failed policies was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Talk about devaluing an award that's supposed to be given for extraordinary service to the country. Of course, I support the rights of individuals to be generous with their wealth. America is one of the most generous countries in the world, and I think it's something we should be proud of. I imagine how our colleagues on the other side of the aisle might act if Republicans honored a prominent conservative philanthropist. You think the media or our Democratic colleagues would applaud it in the same way? No chance. Conservative philanthropists have been not only not given medals of freedom, they've been subjected to endless scrutiny, including politically motivated subpoenas from our Democratic colleagues on the Judiciary Committee just this last year. But now Democrats are rewarding their own, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. It's like the hearing we had this morning on the Finance Committee. Scott Bessent, the next Secretary of Treasury, was there. We had to listen to the ranking member go on a diatribe about why it is so important that American taxpayers be exposed to a multi-trillion-dollar tax increase. Now, he said this is about tax cuts for the wealthy, but the fact of the matter is, and the nominee pointed this out, that the top 1% in the country pay the vast majority of income taxes. But the facts apparently are not all that important to our Democratic colleagues. President Biden wasn't finished rewarding his friends with grants of clemency and presidential honors before he left office. He also sent a parting gift to one of his favorite beneficiaries, which are radical climate activists. Now, I don't doubt that the climate's changing. I don't doubt humans have an impact on it. But to say this is the end-all, be-all of all of our policies to the detriment of our economy, job creation, and so many other important issues just strikes me as misguided. One of the consequences is that Americans have been suffering under high prices for energy under President Biden's presidency. Electricity prices have risen more than 30%. We know that these high prices are the direct result of President Biden's policies, which put climate activists in the front seat, while working families are left behind. But the president couldn't help himself from doing more damage on the way out the door. The day after Christmas, President Biden's Energy Department finalized new climate regulations that would functionally ban almost all natural gas-powered water heaters. Now, why would he do something like that? An analysis from the American Gas Association estimates that 40% of customers will be directly impacted by a rule with a net cost increase, since they'll be required to buy a new gas heater, new electric water heater, excuse me. The AGA notes that the households affected are largely low income and senior citizens on a fixed income, who are more likely to choose a cost-effective water heater that will now be banned under the rule. Now, of course, if people want to buy a more expensive water heater with their own money, I've got no objection to that. I'm all for their freedom to do so. But to impose additional costs on seniors who have fixed incomes and other low-income families who are struggling to get by under the high prices and the 40-year high inflation under the Biden administration simply adds insult to injury. But President Biden didn't stop there. 2 weeks ago, the Biden administration gave the state of California to enforce zero-emission rules for lawnmowers and leaf blowers. Now, this may sound like a small thing, but it's emblematic of much bigger things, and it adds up. This rule would prohibit the sale of new equipment under 25 horsepower or 19 kilowatts that fail to achieve zero emissions. Is there no home appliance or device that's safe from this radical agenda? The Biden administration's targeted gas-powered cars, gas stoves, water heaters, and now they want to get after our lawn mowers and leaf blowers. As I've said before, I don't have any objection to anyone who wants to improve their carbon footprint, if that's important to them, by purchasing new low-emissions lawnmowers. God bless them if they want to do that. But for working families to have to deal with this mandate, who are just trying to keep up with inflation, a new lawnmower might not be in their budget. Well, suffice it to say, the Biden administration is working hard on the way out the door and wreaking havoc in the process. But, Mr. President, Republicans are taking note. We know that with President Trump being sworn into office next Monday, with new majorities in the House and the Senate, that things are going to change. The American people voted for change, and they're going to see a change away from these radical policies and special interest pieces of legislation or regulation that hurt the vast majority of Americans for the benefit of an ideological agenda. One of the tools we're going to be using is something called the Congressional Review Act. As the presiding officer knows, this is a powerful tool which allows a vote of Congress and a presidential signature to essentially veto an administrative agency rule. There is a time frame, I believe it's 60 legislative days, during which we can look back and essentially impose a legislative veto of that rule. Using this mechanism, Congress can review and rescind regulations that it disapproves of. Because, of course, many of these regulations, of course, are promulgated by administrative agencies that never have to stand for election. They never have to appeal to the voters. They never have to explain themselves to the voters. They just do what they do, which is create more and more red tape and regulation. So I'm glad we're going to be able to focus soon after we confirm President Trump's cabinet on Congressional Review Act regulatory disapprovals. I plan on introducing a few of these myself so we can reverse many of the Biden administration's misguided regulations. And I know other colleagues plan to do the same thing. So, Mr. President, President Biden may have been busy over the last 4 months since the last few months since the November the 5th election, but we are gearing up to be even busier undoing much of the mischief that he has wrought during these last couple of months on his way out the door. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, yesterday I highlighted some of of President Biden's final actions as he leaves office, parting gifts, if you will. Well, today I'd like to highlight another of his parting gifts, and I use that in parentheses or with quotations because they're really a slap in the face for the American people and American taxpayers. This past Monday, the Department of Education canceled student loans for 150,000 borrowers. Now, this is not really a cancellation of those loans. It's just a transfer of the responsibility to taxpayers and wiping the slate clean for people who actually agreed to borrow this money so they could attend schools. Then on Wednesday, just 2 days ago, the Biden administration announced an additional cancellation of $4.5 billion for 261,000 borrowers. The president's actions this week and the last week of his presidency brings this total taxpayer bailout to $183.6 billion. Now, remember last June, or June of 2023, the Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that the Department of Education lacks the authority, the legal authority, to implement these across-the-board student loan cancellations. But the Biden administration, never to be one that actually obeys the law, has continued to ignore the ruling of the Supreme Court, issuing a blank check after blank check to borrowers to let them off the hook from paying bills that they agreed to pay in the first instance. This policy is not just illegal, it's profoundly unfair. It's unfair to the families who have sacrificed and saved to send their own children to college. It's unfair to the students who worked multiple jobs during college to avoid accruing large amounts of debt. And it's unfair to all the graduates who've worked hard and paid off their loans. And finally, Mr. President, it's unfair to Americans who have foregone a college education because they couldn't afford the cost. And now they have to pick up the tab for those for whom President Biden has canceled their debt. Any family with a mortgage, a car payment, or a credit card debt knows there's really no such thing as canceling the debt. Somebody is going to pay. Every dollar that was borrowed will eventually be repaid by somebody. It's just a matter of who that someone is. And in this case, it's the American taxpayer. It's really a slap in the face, a kick in the teeth. You choose your metaphor. But it's no surprise that the American taxpayers have rejected the direction in which President Biden and his administration have taken the country, and they voted for a new direction on November the 5th. But that just makes it even more offensive that a lame duck president would proceed full speed ahead with more student debt cancellation after being told no by the Supreme Court and being told no again by voters on November the 5th. Back in May, along with my colleagues, Senator Ernst and Senator Cassidy, I introduced a congressional resolution of disapproval that would have overturned the Biden administration's reckless and unfair student loan socialism. Of course, the Democratic-controlled Senate did not bring that CRA, the Congressional Review Act, up for a vote. But now, with Republicans in the majority, I hope this is something that we can and will address. Student loan socialism would be a great opportunity for the Department of Government Efficiency, headed by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, to take a look at, because there's nothing less efficient and more wasteful and more unfair than taking billions of dollars from taxpayers who didn't go to college to pay for those who did, and who agreed to pay the money back but simply now will not have to do so. The vast majority of Americans don't benefit from this student loan socialism. 87% of Americans don't have student debt. So the 13% who do are now foisting that responsibility on the 13% are foisting it on the 87%. If you look at those who do benefit, it becomes even more clear how little sense this makes. Even the progressive Brookings Institute pointed out that blanket student loan forgiveness benefits those who are better off by income, by education, and by wealth. Unsurprisingly, those with student loans are more likely those with student loans are likely to have higher paying jobs. If we look back at the institutions and not just the individuals that are benefiting from these massive taxpayer subsidies, which is what they are, we'll also find that this is anything but an efficient use of American taxpayer dollars. Over 100 colleges and universities in the United States, including Columbia, Cornell, Yale, and Princeton, are currently under investigation from the Department of Education because of their mishandling of incidents of anti-Semitism on their campuses since October the 7th, 2023. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of ethnicity for institutions that receive federal funding. And so the complaints of anti-Semitism in the wake of the terrorist attacks on Israel have in some cases amounted to violations of federal law. Many of these colleges and universities are rushing to enter into settlements with the Biden administration before the Trump administration takes office on Monday, which of course is not surprising. President Trump has made clear that the taxpayer support for those universities that fail to end anti-Semitic propaganda that has run rampant over the last 2 years, that taxpayer support will end. Now is not the time to reward these institutions with widespread incentives to continue raising their tuition by canceling student debt. And if we want to address the affordability of college, an important topic, widespread student loan socialism is not the way to do it. So as I said, for a variety of reasons, this would be a great place for the Department of Government Efficiency to shine the light on and for us to do something about in the coming days. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget pointed out that we could save the taxpayers as much as $550 billion by reversing all of President Biden's actions on student loan cancellation. $550 billion. So we have our work cut out for us. But one great place to start would be to end the Biden administration's reckless student loan socialism. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I'd note the absence of a quorum. Mr. President, as the world knows by now, yesterday President Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States. I think he's only the second president who has been sworn in on two different occasions, but he is both the 45th and the 47th President of the United States. And it was an honor to see him take the oath of office yesterday in the Capitol Rotunda. I only regret, because of the weather, that more people weren't able to see that in person. I was with a number of my Texas constituents this morning, and they are not accustomed to the cold temperatures, but they were prepared to dress warmly and to deal with it. But they all seemed to be in good spirits because of the outcome of the election, and they were happy to see the president sworn in, as was I. I want to express my personal congratulations, along with that of millions of people across the country, to President Trump and our former colleague, J.D. Vance. I have told people when J.D. Vance came to the Senate, I said I actually had met him before, because when he went to Yale Law School, he actually was an intern on the Judiciary Committee that I serve on, and worked in my office for a very brief period of time. I didn't know him then. As I told him, I knew him before he was famous, before he wrote Hillbilly Elegy and his career took off like a rocket ship. But I'm proud of what Vice President Vance has been able to accomplish. If you think about it, here's a guy at 40 years old is President of the United States. And if you read or listened to Hillbilly Elegy about the circumstances under which J.D. Vance was raised, you can see that he has overcome a lot of obstacles in life. Serving as a United States Marine, I know he was celebrating last night with the Ohio State championship win, being a graduate of that school, but it was great to see him and get sworn in yesterday as well. And again, only in America can something like that happen. It's no secret either that the last 4 years, the Biden administration policies have been nothing but a disaster for the nation, and no state has been more negatively affected than my state, the state of Texas. We have 1,200 miles of common border with Mexico, and the open border policies of the Biden administration have been an unmitigated disaster from a public health standpoint and a public safety standpoint. And many of our border communities have simply been overwhelmed and overrun just by the sheer volume of people coming from all around the world. This is not the sort of immigration that you've seen in the past, where poor people come to the United States across the border to work and send money home. You literally have seen with the Biden open border policies, people from all around the world show up, claim asylum, or be paroled into the interior of the United States, which is like a blinking green light to anybody and everybody that wants to come to America, knowing that they would be released under the Biden administration policies. And we've seen millions, nobody really knows for sure how many millions of people come and basically move in to the United States outside of our legal immigration program, which I think is very important. But also the roughly 2 million, we think, gotaways, people evading law enforcement, and you can only imagine what they're up to. We know that there's no reason to evade law enforcement under the Biden administration policies if you don't have a criminal record, or if you aren't up to no good, because you know you'll be released. So it only is logical, it only makes sense that these are people who are either carrying drugs or had criminal records or otherwise engaged in antisocial activities. And like I said, we think maybe about 2 million of those people made their way into the interior of the United States. One of the most important ways that President Trump began with his signature on these executive orders beginning yesterday is to reverse the policies of the Biden administration and to get our country back on track is securing our southern border. This border crisis, as I indicated, is one that President Biden himself practically invited during his first campaign when he encouraged migrants to, quote, immediately surge the border. I mean, this is crazy talk if you think about it, but that's what he said. And of course, this is perhaps the one campaign promise that President Biden actually kept. In the early months of 2021, President Biden appointed Vice President Harris, we all remember this, as his border czar. Well, he tasked her with the role of managing this growing surge of migrants. Even back then, in the early stages of what was to become a historic humanitarian disaster, some were expressed concerns that Ms. Harris might not be up to the task. But when she was made to answer for her lack of qualifications, she hadn't actually been to the border, specifically the fact she hadn't been there, Kamala Harris made light of the question with a famous quip. She said, "And I haven't been to Europe. I don't understand the point you're making." So somebody pointed out she hadn't been to the border, said, "Well, I hadn't been to Europe," and she didn't understand the point. Well, everybody else got it, even if she didn't. She was singularly unqualified, and she bore this out, I think, by her service as the border czar, singularly unqualified to be the border czar. And it took another 3 months for her to accomplish her one and only visit to the Texas-Mexico border. I can tell you that, as I said, Texas has a 1,200-mile common border. The United States has a 2,000-mile common border, and not every piece of the border is the same. If you go to Arizona or California, New Mexico, many of those places are very different from the border with Texas and Mexico. But on this one visit to the border in Texas, Vice President Harris steered clear of ground zero of this surge of illegal immigration, which is the Rio Grande Valley. That was the epicenter of the border crisis, yet she was a no-show. Instead, she traveled to El Paso, which is another border town, but very, very different, for a sanitized, made-for-TV visit. To add insult to injury, the Vice President visited Texas multiple times last summer to fundraise and to campaign for president, but she didn't take time to go to the border at all. But this should come as no surprise because she seemed completely disinterested from performing any function as the border czar. Under her negligent watch, the surge at the beginning of President Biden's presidency only went from bad to worse. The Biden-Harris administration presided over daily, weekly, and monthly records of illegal crossings across the border. The Customs and Border Protection, the federal agency responsible, has tracked more than 10 million encounters across the nation under President Biden's leadership, including 8.7 million at the southern border. More than 400,000 unaccompanied children. To me, this is one of the scandals that really hasn't gotten adequate attention. 400,000 unaccompanied children have been encountered at the border and placed with sponsors in the United States. Now, the Biden administration resisted any sort of background checks on the sponsors. Matter of fact, they placed these children with other illegal immigrants in the country and in homes where we didn't know whether there were either gang members or people with records as sex offenders, for example. And the sad truth is these children, like the 10 million or so other migrants that came across the border, ended up in the United States courtesy of the cartels, the criminal organizations that get rich smuggling people into the United States. But they don't just smuggle people, they smuggle drugs and other contraband too. But these children in particular Once they arrive in the United States, many of them are exploited, treated as indentured servants until they pay back the debt they owe their traffickers. And those were the lucky ones. Others were trafficked for sex, recruited into gangs, neglected. We don't know. The Biden administration couldn't tell you whether these children were going to school or getting the health care they need or the like. Matter of fact, they said, we have no responsibility. That's the responsibility of the state child welfare organizations. We know they're overwhelmed, and here are 400,000 more children that are dumped into their hands. As a result of the shelter facilities becoming increasingly crowded, the Biden administration rushed the placement process of these children and now has completely lost track of at least 85,000 of those unaccompanied minors. That's according to a New York Times investigative story, where they actually followed up calling the sponsors only to get no answer, knocking on the door. Nobody would come to the door. So we don't know, they don't know what happened to these children. We also know the cartels are getting richer trafficking in drugs, as I mentioned, including fentanyl, a synthetic opioid, which is very different from heroin and cocaine, which require a lengthy process of growing a plant and then processing the drug. Cartels are selling fentanyl, which uses chemical precursors that come from China that then go to Mexico and are mixed up and then pressed to look like a pharmaceutical drug. But they're counterfeit drugs. And they killed more than 70,000 people last year alone. This drug that comes across the southern border with very little, well, we just don't know how much of it actually makes its way across. We know how much is interdicted, but it could be just a fraction of the number that actually makes its way across the border. And here's the tragic statistic. This is the leading cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45 in America. I've been to numerous high schools in Texas where grieving parents said, well, our child ate dinner at the dinner table, then next morning we went and found him or her dead in her room, having taken something they thought was a relatively innocuous drug, only to find out the hard way that it was laced with fentanyl, which took their life. Well, our Border Patrol has simply been overwhelmed by the volume of people coming across the border because there's no such thing as deterrence. You know, one of the things about law enforcement you learn is by enforcing the law, you can discourage other people from violating the law. And by actually enforcing border security, you can deter people from coming in the first place. But without deterrence under the Biden administration, the Border Patrol has simply been overwhelmed with historic numbers of people attempting to cross and successfully crossing. They've not gotten the support they need to handle the magnitude of challenges they face every day. The men and women who serve in the Border Patrol are my heroes. They are loyal, patriotic Americans who put on the uniform and do what their government has asked them to do until they're told that you have to tie one hand behind your back and you can't actually do your job because you just have to welcome people into the country and you can't keep people out who are violating the law. So I want to extend my gratitude to the men and women who serve in the Border Patrol, as well as the National Border Patrol Council, which has been enormously helpful as a credible source of what actually conditions have been along the border so that the American people can know how bad it has gotten to be. The National Border Patrol Council has been our partner and friend and helped, as Senator Cruz and I have welcomed many of our colleagues to the border so that they can see firsthand what we have learned as a result of our many times visiting there. And I particularly want to express my gratitude to Jason Owens, who's the outgoing Border Patrol chief. Even when the administration did not provide adequate support to handle this historic crisis, Jason had the backs of the men and women of the Border Patrol. But the good news is that under President Trump, all of our Border Patrol agents will start receiving the support they need and that they deserve from the federal government. President Trump used his first day in office to make a number of actions addressing this crisis. He declared that this historic ongoing crisis is a national emergency, which it is. He designated the cartels that smuggle the people and the drugs into the country as foreign terrorist organizations. He directed the Departments of State and the Homeland Security to resume the migrant protection protocols, otherwise known as the Remain in Mexico program. So people who want to come to the United States legally through the asylum system, they can't come to the interior of the United States and simply be released. They have to remain in Mexico and await the processing of their claim for asylum. This will, of course, deter economic migrants from making this dangerous journey by having them await their asylum hearings in Mexico. At the same time, the President directed the Department of Homeland Security to stop, catch, and release. If you ask the Border Patrol, how do you explain all of this huge mass of humanity, this tsunami of people coming across the border? And they said, there are no consequences for coming illegally under the Biden administration. And one of those incentives for people to continue to come is ending catch and release, or employing a catch and release policy. Because without detention, you're never going to stop the flow. And this was a primary pull factor of migrants under the Biden administration. President Trump also terminated the Biden administration's unlawful Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuela parole program. So parole is a word that people may be familiar with in a criminal context where people can be paroled out of prison. This is a little different. In the immigration context, this means that individuals who meet certain select criteria can be released into the interior of the United States, but it's supposed to be done on a hardship, case-by-case basis. The Biden administration completely transformed parole by doing it categorically. In other words, they said 30,000 migrants per month are allowed to be released in the United States if you come from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, or Venezuela. That's 360,000 a year, just released into the interior of the United States, and not done on a case-by-case basis. It violated the law Congress put in place, but the Biden administration really didn't seem to care about what the law was. They were going to do what they wanted to do. I'm pleased that President Trump has directed the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice to completely fulfill the requirements of the DNA Fingerprint Act of 2005, a bill that the former senator from Arizona, Senator John Kyle, and I worked to enact. Under that law, the Department of Homeland Security will protect Americans from dangerous criminal illegal immigrants by collecting DNA samples for migrants apprehended at the border. In many instances, it could just be a cheek swab, but that DNA allows you to positively identify people who may be criminal aliens. President Trump's order that the Department of Homeland Security verify the relationships claimed by family units apprehended at the border will help put an end to the cartel's child trafficking that the Biden administration policies enable. Because the cartels are smart and they knew what the policies were, If a family unit, that is an adult and a child came together, they were treated a little bit differently. But we found out the hard way that the cartels would simply hire out these children so that the adults could get into the country claiming to be a family unit. Again, more child trafficking, child abuse, if you will. President Trump's order that the Department of Homeland Security verify these relationships will help put an end to the cartel's child trafficking, which the Biden administration enabled. I'm pleased that President Trump has also ended the use of the Customs and Border Protection One app. This was an app that you could download on your phone that allowed migrants to more quickly and efficiently cross the open border. Under the Biden administration, you could simply make an appointment using this app on your phone, meaning the federal government would facilitate your entry into the United States on a quicker basis. It's really bizarre if you think about it. But it gave the cartels other ways to make money by selling appointments that they had made on the app. It was obviously hijacked by the cartels, who are not dumb, they're smart, and they are driven by a profit motive. I'm glad that President Trump made border security a day one priority of his administration. I look forward to continuing to work with him to help improve the safety for communities all across Texas and all across the nation. But, Mr. President, I'm also thrilled that President Trump has chosen a new U.S. Border Patrol chief, a Texan, Mike Banks. People may have heard of Mike Banks before because he was Governor Abbott's border chief. Mike brings incredible credentials to this job. When the Vice President made only one trip to the Texas-Mexico border during her entire tenure, Mike is a former Border Patrol agent. He's got vast experience at the border. He understands firsthand the impact on our border communities and what our Border Patrol agents have been through. He spent 2/3 of his more than 3 decades of federal law enforcement at the U.S.-Mexico border. As I indicated, Governor Abbott had selected him to serve as the Texas border czar. And Mike's also served in the U.S. Navy military police. So I have had the privilege of getting to know Mike, and I know his qualifications, his experience, and his firsthand and his competence and his firsthand experience dealing with the challenges at our border. And I have no doubt that he will make an outstanding 27th head of the U.S. Border Patrol. I look forward to working with him and President Trump to secure our borders and to make our communities safe again. This is one of the main reasons that President Trump was elected, along with sky-high inflation and the very dangerous world that seems to have grown up in the face of the weakness projected by the Biden administration around the world. But job number one is to secure our borders and protect the American people. And I'm proud of the fact that President Trump has, on day one, taken such important steps to begin that process. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
Will the senator withhold his request?
Mr. President, I would be delighted. Mr. President, I'd like to continue along the theme that our Majority Whip has talked about, particularly the hand-wringing that we're hearing and fear-mongering we're hearing from some of our Democratic colleagues over President Trump's promise to secure the border and the actions that he is taking already early in his administration to do exactly that, including enforcing our existing laws by repatriating or deporting people who have no legal right to be here in the first place. So instead of the fear-mongering of mass deportations, you might just call this enforcing the law, something that's long overdue and that the Biden administration did not do, because the fear-mongering is not based on reality. Our Democratic colleagues would have the American people believe that an elderly grandmother down the street, a peaceful neighbor who would never hurt a fly and poses no threat to anyone, will have ICE banging on her door tomorrow morning. Well, that's the picture that the left wants the American people to imagine when they hear the words mass deportation. Last December, in a Judiciary Committee hearing, then Chairman Senator Durbin, the senator from Illinois, went so far as to say that the president's repatriation program would, quote, weaken our armed forces, close quote, and, quote, devastate our economy, close quote. That's pretty, a lot of hyperbole there. If that's what enforcing our law means, it certainly sounds disturbing. But the American people can see right through what our Democratic colleagues are trying to do here. They're trying to sow fear into the hearts of the American people that this president, who a majority of the voters elected, is going to tear their communities and their families apart. But the image could not be farther from the truth. We know that the Biden administration's own policies and failure to enforce the law have been doing just that, tearing families and communities apart. Start with the fentanyl epidemic in our country that is among the leading causes of death, the leading cause of death for young people between the age of 18 and 45, and which took the lives of more than 70,000 people last year alone in this country. And then there are the 400,000 or more unaccompanied children who've been trafficked across our open borders, and tens of thousands of these children have simply been lost because of the Biden administration's carelessness. The New York Times ran a couple of investigative stories saying they tried to contact the sponsors for 85,000 of these unaccompanied children placed in with sponsors during the Biden administration, and there was no answer and no follow-up, because the Biden administration took the responsibility. It was no longer their job. It was the job of the child welfare agencies in the various states. These tragedies are the result of the policies of the Biden administration, not the Trump administration, and one reason why President Trump was elected decisively on November the 5th. But there's more to the story. Untold misery and heartache have been caused by criminals who've entered our country illegally. By our best estimate, roughly 1.7 million gotaways came across the open borders during the Biden administration. These were people who, if they were here for, let's say, benign reasons, could have just turned themselves into the Border Patrol and claimed asylum knowing they would be released, or would have been paroled by the Biden administration and given a work permit. But at least 1.7 million gotaways were evading law enforcement, frankly, because they were up to no good. And we've now learned what the toll of this invasion of criminality has caused. Last summer in Houston, Texas, a 12-year-old girl named Jocelyn Nugari disappeared on her way to the grocery store. She was found dead in a creek, having been strangled and killed by two men from Venezuela who entered the country illegally. Both of these men had been apprehended by Customs and Border Protection months earlier, but they'd been given a court date and then released. Last month, an illegal migrant from Mexico was caught with a blowtorch near the site of the Kenneth Fire, one of the deadly fires that has ravaged Los Angeles. This was a man who was already on probation and had violated that probation. If it is proven that he started the fire, This would be a slap in the face to everyone whose world has been rocked by the devastation we've seen from these terrible fires out in California. And if it turns out that he was one of the ones who started the fire, that would be another indictment of the policies of the Biden administration for the last 4 years. Then 2 weeks ago, Boston ICE officials arrested multiple MS-13 gang members and criminals on a worldwide law enforcement wanted list for serious crimes. They arrested murder and rape suspects, including a member of a Haitian gang who had 18 convictions. These were the type of people that the Biden administration allowed loose in our country. We know that ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, have now arrested criminals who've committed sexual assault, domestic violence, and drug and weapon-related crimes. But these are just a few examples of the hundreds of criminal arrests made just in the few short weeks since President Trump took office. To the Democrats who would decry these arrests, would you want these criminals to be your neighbor? I'm going to guess the answer is no. With criminal illegal migrants running rampant throughout the country, it's no surprise that Americans voted overwhelmingly for a president who pledged to reverse the course from this reckless open border policies of the Biden administration. We know last week President Trump signed the Laken-Riley Act. I was honored to be president at the White House with our friend and colleague, Senator Katie Britt, to watch him sign this legislation into law. Laken-Riley, for whom this law was named, was a 22-year-old woman who went missing after going on a run. She was killed by a Venezuelan national who was also a gang member. He should have never been running loose in our country in the first place. It was President Biden's open border policies that led to this horrific murder of Laken-Riley. The Laken-Riley Act will now, having been signed into law, will require the Department of Homeland Security to detain non-citizens charged with or convicted of theft-related crimes or any crime that results in death or serious bodily injury. I introduced an amendment during the deliberations on the bill that would add assaulting a law enforcement officer to that list. As we know here in the Senate, there's a 60-vote threshold to be able to close off debate and to actually move on to pass legislation. And it ensures that we have bipartisan consensus. And I'm glad to say that the Laken-Riley Act passed the Senate with bipartisan support. And I appreciate the recognition that the status quo during the previous administration could no longer exist. The Laken-Riley Act is not an example of some extremism, but it's an issue that affects day-to-day safety and the livelihoods of regular Americans. And I think it's perfectly fair to say that the deportations or repatriations that the Trump administration has already done are very much in the spirit of the Laken-Riley Act. Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem made clear over the weekend that the Trump administration's first priority will be to detain and deport what she called the worst of the worst. That is, bad actors with warrants out for arrest for murder, rape, assault, and drug trafficking. And after the criminal aliens are deported, she said the next priority will be individuals under final orders of deportation. In other words, those who've exhausted all possible legal recourse to be able to stay in the United States, having lost their claim for asylum. Mr. President, there are more than 1.5 million immigrants who've exhausted their legal remedies in a court of law and are under final orders of deportation, but the Biden administration simply did nothing about it. So removing these individuals who have no legal right to remain in the United States and who've been given due process and have lost their case Deporting them is a common sense next step and one that is long overdue. So when the mainstream media and our Democratic colleagues engage in fear-mongering about these so-called mass deportations, I hope people remember we're talking primarily about criminals, and we're talking about people who have no legal right to remain in the United States, having exhausted all of their legal remedies in order to do so. I hope we can all agree that these are not people who deserve to remain in America. America naturalizes about 1 million people a year. I personally believe, and I think Americans generally agree, that legal immigration has been the secret sauce for America. It's what helped make us the great country we are today, prosperous and strong. But it is illegal immigration that has been a scourge and has created much heartache and misery, and frankly, makes a laughingstock when we talk about the rule of law. Removing and deporting en masse the criminals and gangs that have entered our country illegally over the last 4 years and face no consequences means that Americans will have less to fear, and they will be safer in their communities and in their homes. They will no longer have to fear that one of their children will accidentally take a fentanyl-laced pill, make it less likely. And we still have work to do there, obviously. And they no longer will have to fear that their daughter will go on a run around her college campus or walk to the grocery store and never return home because they've been abducted and murdered by somebody who had no legal right to be here in the first place. By ending President Biden's open border policies and deporting criminals and gang members and people under final orders of deportation, President Trump is making our nation safe again. And that's not something we should fear. It's something we should welcome. Mr. President, I yield the floor. President Trump is already off to the races to unleash a golden age of energy dominance in a number of important ways. On the first day of his presidency, he reversed President Biden's disastrous LNG pause. This will allow our allies to access to the oil and natural gas that comes from Texas projects in the Gulf of America, rather than relying on our adversaries. Furthermore, it's not just Texans and our European allies who can benefit from President Trump's and Secretary Wright's agenda. By reforming the permitting process, we can make sure that everyone within the United States has access to our abundant domestic energy supplies. And it will bring prices down, as President Trump has said is important in his fight against 40-year high inflation under the previous administration. Unfortunately, some of our New England states, notably states like Maine and Massachusetts, are still reliant on foreign fuel. And that's because of the lack of pipelines that would take the LNG and transport it up into that part of the United States. Due to stringent shipping requirements from the Jones Act, it's more costly to transport natural gas from the Gulf of America to New England than it is for these states to import fuel from foreign countries. The Jones Act was intended to protect U.S. shipping, but in this case, it has the unintended effect of decreasing our energy independence. I have no doubt that common sense permitting reforms can right this wrong. I look forward to working with President Trump and his administration to unleash American energy through an all-of-the-above approach so that Texas and the Gulf of America can once again supply the nation and the world with reliable, affordable energy. The Biden administration's energy policies lined the pockets of America's adversaries to appease climate radicals while hardworking Americans were stuck with the check. But President Trump has promised a golden new age, and I look forward to making Texas and America the center of that. Madam President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum. Mr. President.
The Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I have, are we in a quorum call? No. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have 7 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. These have been approved by both the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Mr. President, last week the Senate voted to confirm Pam Bondi as U.S. Attorney General. I was proud to support her nomination both at the Senate Judiciary Committee level and on the Senate floor. Today, the Senate Judiciary Committee held a markup on the nomination of Kash Patel for Director of the FBI. Likewise, I was happy to support his nomination in committee, and I look forward to supporting him here on the Senate floor as soon as that vote comes before us. One of President Trump's most important pledges during the campaign was to end the politicalization and the weaponization of the Department of Justice, including the FBI. Pam Bondi and Kash Patel, I think, are outstanding picks to fulfill this pledge, which is very important, and I'm pleased the Senate's moving to confirm them with no delay. I believe that the FBI and the Department of Justice are 2 of the most important institutions in America. If you look around the world, you see a lot of countries that have a similar economic system to ours, and you wonder, why is America uniquely prosperous? Why is it that we succeed where others fail? And I believe it's 2 things. One is our independent judiciary, and secondly, our institutions of justice, like the FBI and the Department of Justice, who are supposed to discharge their responsibilities without regard to politics and without regard to the sort of activities we've seen in recent years. We know that both of these individuals, Mr. Patel and Ms. Bondi, have their work cut out for them. The mission of the Department of Justice, after all, is to uphold the rule of law, to keep the country safe, and to protect civil rights. The FBI's mission is to protect the American people and to uphold the Constitution of the United States. Under the Biden administration, and even before that, the Department of Justice and the FBI has failed to achieve those noble and worthy goals. Of course, back to even during President Trump's first term of office, there was the infamous Crossfire Hurricane FBI investigation. There was the so-called Russian hoax based on a phony piece of Russian propaganda known as the Steele dossier, which ultimately we found out was part of the opposition research that Hillary Clinton's campaign collected during her campaign against President Trump back in 2016. This was dressed up to make it look like a credible bit of intelligence when, in fact, it was Russian propaganda, we ultimately found out, Russian disinformation. 2 weeks ago, during his hearing at the Judiciary Committee, Kash Patel told me that the rule of law is one of the fundamental precepts that make America an exceptional nation. Without the rule of law, he said, and I quote, "We go back to the Uganda that my father fled." Kash Patel's adherence to the mission of the FBI and its parent agency, the Department of Justice, is a stark contrast with what we've seen in recent years. We saw, for example, Merrick Garland's misguided memo in October of 2021 directing the FBI to work with U.S. attorneys to, quote, discuss strategies for addressing threats from parents who were taking an active role in their children's education by participating in student parent-teacher meetings and school board meetings. Similarly, we have the FBI Richmond field office that sent a memo in 2023 suggesting that traditional Catholics might pose a threat as violent domestic extremists. So we know that there are example after embarrassing example of how the FBI and the DOJ have gotten off track. A report from the House Judiciary Committee highlighted, for example, the FBI's misguided attempt to artificially inflate the number of domestic extremism threats by claiming Americans who exercising their First Amendment rights were somehow potential domestic terrorist threats. Not to mention the FBI's role in censoring information related to Hunter Biden's criminal activities. A Senate report from the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee in 2020 detailed many of Hunter's and his associates' unseemly and likely illegal activities, including payments from Ukrainian, Russian, Kazakh, and Chinese nationals, and revealed that the FBI may have had knowledge of these activities for some time and done nothing. In September 2020, when the House Judiciary Committee sent a follow-up letter to Director Wray related to Hunter Biden's alleged misconduct, the FBI stonewalled them and refused to confirm or deny any ongoing investigations. I know that's a common response by the FBI, where they're not going to talk about ongoing investigations, and certainly we understand that as a routine matter, there shouldn't be any sort of interference in ongoing investigations. But Congress has a unique constitutional role of oversight, and essentially what Director Wray was saying, he wasn't willing to give the Congress as an oversight body the information we need in order to do our job. Of course, despite these numerous efforts within the FBI and the Department of Justice to protect Hunter Biden from accountability for his crimes, we know his own father issued a presidential pardon in the final weeks of his presidency, even though for months he had said he would never do such a thing, but then he did, claiming his son was selectively and unfairly prosecuted. Well, my recollection was Hunter was convicted of one crime by a jury but pled guilty to others, so it's not clear to me how President Biden can say that he was selectively and unfairly prosecuted for the crimes that he pled guilty to. It's hard to imagine thinking someone was unfairly targeted when the entire government, all the government agencies involved, did everything they can to assist the Biden family and to protect that person from justice. Well, it's no surprise that the American people were upset and even outraged by this. Who could forget the marked differences, the double standard in response when President Trump was found to have sensitive documents at his home in Mar-a-Lago, when President Biden was found to have sensitive documents at his home in Wilmington, Delaware. And all the while, during the historic crime wave we've experienced in recent years, Merrick Garland directed his agency not to enforce mandatory minimums against most drug crimes. He did this while Americans across the country were suffering from fatal drug overdoses at record numbers, especially from fentanyl, which took the lives of approximately 70,000 Americans last year alone. The result of all of these abuses of authority has been a loss of trust and confidence by the American people in these important institutions, the FBI and the Department of Justice. These institutions were no longer believed to be engaged in the fair administration of justice based on facts and evidence, as opposed to political gamesmanship. Now, I realize that Attorney General Bondi and soon-to-be Director Patel are going to have a huge task ahead of them to restore these agencies to their core missions and to restore the trust that has been eroded of the American people in our American system of justice. But both of these individuals have pledged to do just that, and I believe they should have an opportunity to do that. Pam Bondi, after all, has been a career prosecutor She's then went on to be Attorney General of Florida for two terms. As a former Attorney General of my state in Texas, I know how tough that job can be, but she's done an outstanding job, and I have no doubt that her promotion to U.S. Attorney General by President Trump was well-deserved. She's prepared for this important job. My goal for the Department of Justice and the FBI is to restore the nonpartisan functioning of our country's chief law enforcement agencies. The American people deserve an FBI and a Department of Justice that they can trust. They deserve live under a system where the guilty are prosecuted and where the innocent are not unfairly targeted. They deserve to live in a place where political views are not a basis for a criminal investigation, and where an accused person is still presumed innocent until proven guilty. In short, we need a Department of Justice that will deal out justice even-handedly, without fear or favor. I believe that being Attorney General is probably one of the toughest jobs here in Washington, D.C., because you're not only the chief law enforcement officer for the country, you're also a member of the President's cabinet. But even given the difficult nature of the job, Merrick Garland practically abdicated his responsibility as chief law enforcement officer in order to be a partisan advocate for President Biden's policies. President Trump's Attorney General will have a chance to turn the page from Merrick Garland's failures by reversing the partisan hackery that has been a part and parcel of President Biden's Department of Justice. President Trump's Attorney General can restore the Department of Justice to its core mission. Pam Bondi can serve President Trump and the nation well by enforcing the law that's on the books and ending the weaponization of political enemies. Similarly, Kash Patel has an opportunity to turn the page from the abuses and the lack of accountability that we've seen at the FBI in recent years. So I look forward to working with Ms. Bondi and Mr. Patel in their noble endeavor to restore trust in our nation's justice system, and by doing so, to restore the trust of the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Not.
Mr. President, I was glad to see President Zelensky clearly express his gratitude to President Trump and the American taxpayer for our support for the country of Ukraine over the last 3 years. There's been much discussion in international communities and here at home on the war between Russia, which has now been going on for 3 long years. It has cost hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, with millions of people displaced as a result of the war. Through it all, the Ukrainian people have demonstrated extraordinary courage and resilience. But one thing is clear: it's time for the war in Ukraine to end. President Trump is right. But the more difficult question is how? Years ago, I recall General David Petraeus, the leader of our military and Central Command in heading up our efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, was asked the question, how does the war end? And he said, you tell me how the war ends. Wars are easy to start and hard to conclude. This is the most difficult question of all. How does it end? We should all be grateful to President Trump for taking on the difficult but essential task of brokering a peace agreement to end this devastating war. During the contentious meeting at the Oval Office last week, President Trump commented that he hoped to be known and recognized as a peacemaker. Well, this would be no small feat, but it is the right position to take. It's not hard to look at this incredible devastation, the massive casualties, the human misery and suffering of the last 3 years and understand that it's time for the bloodshed to end. But it will take both sides, Ukraine and Russia, to accomplish this goal. Ukraine cannot do it on its own. President Trump was correct to point out to President Zelensky last week during this high-intensity meeting in the Oval Office. He said, "I have to align myself with both of you in order to make a deal." President Trump's skill at making deals is famous, but this would be the crowning achievement of his life if he's able to make this happen. But the point is, in order to achieve a lasting peace, both sides of the conflict must be willing to sit down and negotiate and make concessions, no matter how hard that is. I'm glad to see that President Zelensky has indicated a willingness for Ukraine to do so, in part through a critical minerals arrangement with the United States government. Such a deal would compensate the United States and its taxpayers for our many years of military and economic support for Ukraine. And it would actually be a vested interest that the United States would have every reason to want to protect in the future. And some have called that an implicit security arrangement. Perhaps most importantly, though, in order to ensure a lasting peace, there must be some real and tangible and enforceable security assurances for Ukraine. But to put this in proper context, we have to consider history, the events that led us up to this point. In 1994, the United States, Russia, and Britain signed something called the Budapest Memorandum. This was shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and as the Soviet Union broke up, it turned out that Ukraine, which was formerly part of the Soviet Union, had the third largest nuclear weapons stockpile in the world. The Budapest Memorandum was an agreement between the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia that if Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons, then its territorial integrity and independence would be preserved and respected. This was a historic point in world history. It was an important step toward nuclear non-proliferation and prevented the rise of a major third nuclear power in Eastern Europe. But unfortunately, Russia proceeded to violate that same agreement in 2014 with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, and then, as we know, the Russian government, led by Mr. Putin, violated that agreement a second time in February 2022 with its invasion of Ukraine. If Russia was unwilling to honor the commitments it made in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 by its invasion of Crimea in 2014 and its invasion of Ukraine as a nation in 2022, how can Ukraine be assured that Russia will honor a peace agreement brokered in 2025? That perhaps is the single most important question that we need to ask. Given the history and pattern of behavior by Russia, if Zelensky does not receive adequate security assurances, will this incentivize him to do other things to protect and preserve his nation? For example, to reacquire a nuclear weapons program. Against an existential threat, we know that President Zelensky himself has floated this as a possibility. And more recently, the newly elected Chancellor of Germany had suggested that both Germany and the United Kingdom would share, perhaps, their nuclear weapons capabilities with Ukraine, which would be a dramatic and dangerous development. But this is not all. We have to keep in mind that both President Zelensky and President Putin are not fighting this war in some sort of vacuum. Allies of the United States and adversaries alike around the world are watching. Will our actions in Ukraine suggest to allies in South Korea, for example, that they should pursue their own nuclear weapon capability, especially in light of the North Korean nuclear program, which receives Russian assistance? Will more citizens of Taiwan cast their vote for representatives pushing closer alignment with the People's Republic of China as the most prudent way for their people to maintain a guarantee against a catastrophic war in the Indo-Pacific? Seeing that unanswered aggression is awarded, would President Xi be emboldened to seize Taiwan, as he has made clear he intends to do one way or the other? These are just a few of the unintended consequences that could play out depending on how these peace negotiations transpire and how they develop. We, the duly elected representatives of the American people, must ask ourselves, will a world of unreliable security assurances, of greater prospects of nuclear proliferation, of insufficient deterrence in the face of unprovoked aggression result in a safer world for our children and grandchildren? Well, given these difficult but necessary questions, I would once again applaud President Trump for taking the initiative of embracing peace through strength. His approach is a correct one, and he is right that an important piece of this is for our NATO allies, who in fact live in Europe, where Ukraine's located, need to increase their contribution to our collective security under the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. Through strength, we can guarantee peace both in Europe and around the world. The suffering resulting from the Russian invasion of Ukraine on two occasions, 2014 and 2022, has been devastating, not only for Ukrainians, but also for Russians as well, who've lost hundreds of thousands of casualties in the process. President Trump pointed out during their meeting that with President Zelensky that both sides are losing 2,000 soldiers a week. As we sit here and talk, people are being shot and dying in the battlefield. What President Trump is doing to secure peace in this dangerous world is an act of moral leadership, and I believe divinely inspired. Jesus said in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. If President Trump is successful in securing a lasting peace, I, for one, think he will have earned the Nobel Peace Prize. As President Zelensky himself said in the Oval Office, he said, if President Trump can bring peace to our country, I think he will be on this wall. Of course, referring to the walls of the Oval Office that have the pictures of historic American presidents who've done great and important things. It's my sincere hope that President Zelensky and President Putin will both accept the olive branch offered by President Trump by coming to the table and by making the necessary enforceable concessions to ensure a lasting peace. Mr. President, I yield the floor. For this reason, I was disappointed to see one of my fellow Texans in our congressional delegation go so far as to condone these kinds of activities. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett recently made comments encouraging violent protests at a virtual rally. She said, and I quote, these are her words, not mine. She said, all I want to see happen on my birthday is for Elon to be taken down. Well, that could be interpreted any one of a number of ways, but I believe it's wrong to wish on any American, much less a fellow Texan. And I would expect better than this sort of incendiary rhetoric from a member of Congress who was elected to her position because of the very democracy we are fortunate to enjoy. But this isn't the only thing she said recently that has raised eyebrows and resulted in condemnation. Congresswoman Crockett recently commented that our Governor Greg Abbott, who happens to be a paraplegic as a result of a terrible accident years ago, she said that she referred to him as Governor Hot Wheels, presumably because he's in a wheelchair due to an accident decades ago. And then it's Senator Cruz, my colleague, the junior senator from Texas, she said should be knocked over the head, like hard. This is disgraceful, and we should call it for what it is. We have a duty as elected officials to bring out the best in our country, not to take the low road. And particularly, we should not encourage harm against people we don't particularly agree with. This is a disturbing trend in political rhetoric, one that has turned to violence. Again, not for the first time, but we should condemn it and we should shut it down now. These events should serve as a wake-up call that it's past time to turn down the temperature. I believe that all Americans and all Texans deserve better.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I have one request for committees. Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Madam President, I have one request for committee to meet during today's session of the Senate, and this request has been approved by both the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Madam President, America is an exceptional nation. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech and of the press, private property rights, free and fair elections, the rule of law, and an independent judiciary. All of these help make us exceptional. But we Americans often take this for granted because these principles, these values are so ingrained in our way of life. It's who we are. But it also makes it more challenging for us to understand how different other countries may be from us. It shouldn't be a surprise, though, if you think about it. History, culture, economics, all matter. But sadly, this is a lesson that seems like we and others need to learn over and over again. When it comes to Russia, it's worth recalling Churchill's description of the former Soviet Union. He called it a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma. Well, when it comes to negotiating a peace in Ukraine, we might be tempted to assume that Vladimir Putin is working from the same playbook as other stakeholders, but that is simply not the case. The fundamental differences between Russia and the West have become all that much more apparent in the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. This is precisely what's made it such a difficult challenge to end the war. And that's what makes President Trump's efforts all that much more noble when we consider the monumental task that he's seeking to accomplish. As I've said before, I'll say it again, I'm grateful to President Trump for his leadership and his efforts to end the conflict that has lasted far too long, more than 3 years now. During his first 100 days, President Trump has done more than President Biden did in 4 years. He's made clear to the Europeans that they need to step up and assume greater ownership of their continental security. And he successfully persuaded them to increase their defense spending and enhancing deterrence against future aggression. His representatives, the president's representatives, have led several rounds of negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians, something that President Biden did not even attempt. And President Trump has secured a key critical minerals deal with Ukraine, which will help fund the reconstruction of that country. It will help compensate America for its investments in Ukraine's defense and dissuade future Russian aggression. But there is one significant obstacle in achieving a lasting end to this conflict, and that, of course, is Vladimir Putin. Succinctly stated, Vladimir Putin's Russia is a police state. In Russia, people who buck the government mysteriously disappear or fall out of windows to their death, or are poisoned, imprisoned, or die of suspect causes like Alexei Navalny. In Russia, the government targets religious minorities, imposing fines and criminal charges. In Russia, the government controls the media. Independent media outlets are censored, suppressed, or shuttered if they do not conform to the party line. Under Vladimir Putin, government redistributes private property based on political loyalties, giving rise to the oligarchs that we've heard so much about. Then there are the alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Russia during its invasion of Ukraine. Take, for example, the bombing of Ukraine's civilian energy infrastructure during the first winter of Russia's full-scale invasion, or consider the mass abduction of Ukrainian children. Thousands of Ukrainian children have been deported to Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion, with many adopted into Russian families or sent to camps where they're subjected to ideological indoctrination designed to erase their Ukrainian identity. The bombing of Ukraine's power grid, which was part of a state policy of widespread attacks on the civilian population, further illustrates the point. One particular event in Bucha stands out. Russian troops intentionally massacred more than 400 civilians, apparently as part of a systematic clearing operation to secure their path to the capital at Kyiv. Russian paratroopers from the 234th Air Assault Regiment interrogated and executed unarmed men of fighting age and killed people who unwittingly crossed their paths, whether it was children fleeing from their families, with their families, or locals hoping to find groceries, or people simply trying to get back home on their bicycle. The victims of this massacre were of all ages and professions. This massacre would be deemed a war crime under international humanitarian law, and because of their systematic and widespread nature, the killings in Bucha could also amount to crimes against humanity. So the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin is nothing like the United States or Europe, for that matter. Russia, of course, has its own history, culture, and a form of government. And as I said earlier, it can be easy for the West to assume, as we've done before, that our values are shared by other countries. But that is most decidedly not the case with Putin's Russia. Putin has made his unwillingness to end this unprovoked and barbaric war as plain as day. He's shown no remorse that his country is nearing 1 million casualties. He clearly doesn't care about the Russian people who've been sacrificed to his fantasy of an empire restored, and his tolerance for casualties appears without limit. In fact, Putin has done nothing to justify the hope that he might be persuaded to end this war. To the contrary, despite Putin's declared ceasefire over the Easter holiday, Russia then proceeded to launch attacks into Ukraine that killed innocent civilians. More recently, Russia launched 2 ballistic missiles and 165 drones, wounding 11 people, including 2 children. One 54-year-old Kyiv resident whose car caught fire during the attack expressed frustration at the lack of progress for peace, saying they can't agree on anything, and we are the ones who suffer the consequences. An 18-year-old student said, "People are just suffering all the time. It's still very hard to see our country constantly being destroyed." President Trump has noted in a statement on Truth Social, quote, "There was no reason for Putin to be shooting missiles into civilian areas in the cities and towns over the last few days." The president went on to suggest that Putin may not actually be trying to stop the war. I agree with President Trump. There's no indication he's trying to stop the war. But Vladimir Putin is making a grave mistake in stringing the President of the United States and the rest of the world along while innocent lives are being taken. In order to achieve peace, President Trump needs a good faith partner, both in Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian President Putin. Notably, while Zelensky has met with the president several times, most recently at the Vatican, Putin has not. Instead of working for peace, Putin recently threatened to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine in order to bring the war, in his own words, quote, "to a logical conclusion with the outcome that Russia requires," close quote. Well, how does this relate to President Trump's peace efforts? Well, we should listen to Putin's own words. In a speech he delivered to the Russian Foreign Ministry last year, Putin argues that peace with Ukraine would require a removal of Ukrainian troops from the southern and eastern part of that country, the demilitarization and denuclearization of Ukraine, a neutral and non-NATO Ukraine, and the removal of all Western sanctions. The hard reality is that Putin sees this conflict not just as a war between Russia and Ukraine, but a war between Russia and the West. In this same speech, he says the West is primarily at fault for the conflict in the world today, and that it was the West that incited a Ukrainian coup in 2014 and further unrest in eastern Ukraine in 2022, which necessitated Russian military action to liberate the people of Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Putin says the war would have ended long ago in March 22 had it not been for the West supplying Ukraine with weapons and political support and extending the conflict. Likewise, Putin sees Ukraine's prospective association with NATO or a European peacekeeping force as an inherent extension of Western imperialism, which he cannot tolerate. He even goes so far as to say Russia could not accept a ceasefire, since it would give time for Ukraine to rearm. Finally, Putin shares a vision for a multipolar world to counter what he perceives as Western imperialism and Russia's efforts to use security and economic agreements towards these ends. In sum, Madam President, Putin does not see this negotiation as a means to bring about the end to the conflict in Ukraine. He sees it as a key piece to a larger war against the West. In essence, this negotiation is much bigger than Russia and Ukraine. We need to listen to what Putin says, but also watch what he does as he attempts to stall peace negotiations while attempting to achieve his larger aims. Putin's invasion of Ukraine just over 3 years ago was an obvious violation of another international agreement that Russia was a party to, the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. Under this agreement, Ukraine willingly gave up its arsenal of nuclear weapons, the third largest in the world, in exchange for security assurances by Russia and other signatories. Russia went on then to violate the Budapest Memorandum in 2014 when it invaded Crimea and annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Then, as we all know, Russia violated the memorandum a second time in February 22 with its invasion of Ukraine proper. If Russia was unwilling to honor the commitments enshrined in the Budapest Memorandum in 2014 and 2022, how then can Ukraine, or the rest of the world for that matter, be assured that they will honor a peace agreement brokered in 2025? And once again, Putin is threatening nuclear war if he does not receive the guarantees of a further demilitarized Ukraine. But if he thinks these threats are an effective method of intimidating the United States and President Trump, he is mistaken. President Trump has made very clear that he will not allow Russia to continue doing what he calls tapping us along. Putin may well have been able to dupe Obama. He may have been able to intimidate Biden, but any attempt to fool or strong-arm President Trump will not succeed. If Putin thinks he's going to pull the wool over his eyes or box him into a corner, Putin is in for a very rude shock. Madam President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, as every high school student of government knows, the Constitution of the United States of America provides for 3 co-equal branches of government: the legislative branch under Article 1, the judicial branch under Article 3, and the executive branch under Article 2. What I'd like to talk about briefly is the role of the chief executive, the President of the United States. Under our Constitution, the President has vast authorities. The chief executive enforces federal laws, oversees the entire federal executive branch of government, manages federal agencies and departments, includes appointing and removing high-ranking officials like cabinet members and agency heads, subject to Senate confirmation for certain positions. The President of the United States, the chief executive, is also the commander-in-chief. He leads our armed forces and directs military operations. While only Congress can declare war, the President can deploy troops and respond to immediate threats, often with congressional authorization, but not always. The President, the chief executive, the head of the executive branch, can grant pardons and reprieves for federal crimes except in cases of impeachment. This power is nearly absolute and cannot be overturned. The president also has legislative powers in the form of a veto. He can veto legislation passed by Congress, preventing those acts of Congress from becoming law unless both chambers override that veto with a 2/3 majority vote. And while the president is not a legislator per se, he can propose legislation, and often does, and influences the legislative agenda by proposing budgets, delivering the State of the Union address, and advocating for certain policies. The president can, the chief executive of our government, can call special sessions of Congress, and in rare cases actually adjourn Congress if the House and the Senate cannot agree on adjournment. The head of the executive branch, the President of the United States, is also our chief diplomat. He shapes U.S. foreign policy, negotiates treaties, and appoints ambassadors with Senate confirmation. The president can also enter into executive agreements with foreign nations which do not require Senate approval but are binding during that president's term. The president is also, as part of his diplomatic powers, serves as our primary representative in international relations. And then when it comes to judges, the Article III branch, the President of the United States, the head of the executive branch, nominates federal judges, including Supreme Court judges, obviously subject to Senate confirmation, as well as members of the inferior judiciary. Though the Justice Department, the Solicitor, through the Justice Department, the Solicitor General, the President can also influence legal interpretations in cases brought before federal courts. In addition, the President of the United States, the Chief Executive, can issue executive orders, as we've seen, or directives or proclamations to manage federal operations or implement policy, provided they align with existing law, of course, or constitutional authority. Then, in times of crisis, the President of the United States may assume broader authority under statutes like the National Emergencies Act, although such actions are subject to congressional oversight and review. And then there are the implied powers, as they've been called. Historical precedent and constitutional interpretation allow the president some flexibility in areas like national security, economic management, and crisis response. These are the powers that the Constitution and laws of the United States confer upon the head of the executive branch, the President of the United States. The President of the United States, of course, is elected by all the American people. But what are we to do when the President of the United States is incapable of performing the duties of his office? Who is it that purports to act for the President if the President is incapable of acting himself? Well, this was something that was contemplated even as far back as the Federalist Papers during the founding of our country. Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 70, "Energy in the executive is the leading character in the definition of good government. It's essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks and to the steady administration of the laws." Hamilton also warned of the dangers associated with a weak executive or a weak president. He said a feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for bad execution, and a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice bad government. Well, unfortunately, Alexander Hamilton's warnings ring true when we consider the presidency of Joe Biden, a weak, feeble executive who proved incapable of performing many of the duties of his office. Last June, during the presidential debate, the American people saw with their own eyes what many had known to be true, but would not admit publicly. Our sitting commander-in-chief was suffering from severe cognitive decline. We now know that there was a conspiracy to hide the president's true condition by his family, by his staff, by the media, and by many public officials. We were told over and over again, don't believe your lying eyes. Jake Tapper, who co-authored a Mea Culpa for the journalism profession, summed it up this way, quote, what the world saw at Joe Biden's one and only 2024 debate was not an anomaly. It was not a cold. It was not someone who was under or over prepared. It was not somebody who was just a little tired. It was the natural result of an 81-year-old man whose capabilities had been diminishing for years. Biden, his family, and his team let their self-interest and fear of another Trump term justify an attempt to put an at times addled old man in the Oval Office for 4 more years. Close quote. Mr. President, this is a true constitutional crisis, bigger than President Biden, and it cannot be absolved by a collective apology by the press or an election where that president's party lost. We should know, the American people should know, and still do not know, precisely what should happen when a president is incapable of performing his or her constitutional duties. Tomorrow I'll be co-chairing, along with my colleague from Missouri, Senator Eric Schmitt, in the Senate Judiciary Committee, a hearing to delve into the constitutional implications of President Biden's cognitive decline while in office. At that hearing, we'll begin to address some of the many unanswered questions from this scandal, questions that are foundational to the functioning of our form of government. One of the aims of the hearing will be shining a light on what exactly went on at the White House during the Biden administration. The chain of events that occurred within the Biden administration matters, and we cannot discount it merely because he is no longer in office. With a compromised president, the very legitimacy of our government is undermined. From the Biden border crisis to the disastrous results from the withdrawal in Afghanistan, the American people were the ones who paid the price. And it's now clear that for many months, no one knows exactly how long, the president was simply not up to the task. So we have to ask difficult questions, like who was really in charge during the last months of the Biden administration? Was it his wife? Other members of his family? Was it his chief of staff? Was it others? Well, none of these individuals, whoever they may be, were elected by the American people. Whoever happened to be making those decisions and carrying out the duties of the office of president was not somebody who was authorized by the Constitution or by a vote of the American people. This, Mr. President, is an existential threat to our democratic republic. This threat, and it cannot be ignored, and it will not be ignored. History tells us this state of affairs was reminiscent of the Wilson presidency, where the First Lady assumed many of her husband's duties during his infirmity, but kept it secret from the American people. It was one of the events that inspired those who drafted the 25th Amendment of the United States Constitution. Certainly, the American people did not consent to being governed by Jill Biden, and they didn't elect the White House chief of staff or whoever else purported to act on the president's behalf. The hearing we'll hold tomorrow in the Judiciary Committee will examine in depth these constitutional questions and what happens when the president is no longer capable of performing the duties of his office. Our country has faced many difficult challenges in the past, including of succession for presidents. For example, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963. In the aftermath of that assassination and the questions it raised, Congress began considering a constitutional amendment about presidential succession. In 1965, Senators Birch Bayh and Representative Emanuel Seller introduced a resolution in Congress to clarify the order and procedures of presidential succession. This resolution was the basis for the 25th Amendment, which Congress approved in July of that same year. And of course, for every constitutional amendment, every state must actually, 3/4 of the state must actually ratify that resolution. And the states finished ratifying the 25th Amendment in 1967 after it was first proposed in 1965. And President Lyndon Johnson certified the amendment that February. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution provides a roadmap for succession in instances of presidential incapacity. Section 4 gives the Vice President, in this case Vice President Harris, or a majority of the President's cabinet, that would be President Biden's cabinet, it gives them the authority to challenge the President's ability to carry out the functions of his office subject to a vote in Congress. But in this instance that we all witnessed less than a year ago, Kamala Harris and the cabinet did nothing. Or rather, they did something. They hid the truth from the American people. So who, Mr. President, this hearing will ask, is accountable when the cabinet fails to do its duty, when the Vice President fails to do her duty under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment? Are there penalties for failing to act? Is there any accountability whatsoever? Should there be? The framers of this amendment wanted it to be possible, yet difficult, to remove a president when absolutely necessary. Ultimately, though, they acknowledged that the execution of the 25th Amendment would depend on the good faith of the cabinet and the vice president. But Biden's cabinet did not act in good faith, nor did the vice president herself. They acted in their political and personal self-interest. This is the paradox of self-government. Many of the rules, traditions, and institutions that sustain our republic are self-executing, self-enforcing. And so the health and legitimacy of our democratic republic rests on the character of the men and women who serve in government. This brings us to the most crucial questions we will address in the hearing. Why was the 25th Amendment not invoked? And what factors do we need to look at that may have played a role in congressional inaction? Most importantly, as part of our legislative responsibilities, should Congress consider amending the 25th Amendment further to further clarify responsibilities and protocols in case this disaster befalls our nation again? As a government, as an American people, it's imperative that we have clear contingency plans when emergency strikes. And yes, it is an emergency when we have a sitting president who's unable to discharge the duties of his office. He certainly could not have been trusted to make one of the gravest decisions that faces any president in history: what to do in matters of war and peace, a situation that feels all that much more real given the current events in the Middle East. The concerns raised by this incident stretch beyond the boundaries of partisan politics. We must not turn away from the search for answers, and it is not an overstatement to say the future of our country could one day hinge on how we choose to act or not act on this issue. So tomorrow's hearing is a first important step in preserving this land of the free for future generations. In these United States, those in authority derive their power from the consent of the governed. But during much of the last 4 years, we know that our country was largely led by unelected staff whose names are unknown by the American people. I look forward to tomorrow's hearing, examining these hard but existentially important questions that must be answered from this monumental scandal. Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, it's July 30th, my older daughter's birthday, but we are approaching a season that senators and our staff alike look forward to each year with some anticipation, which is going back home, talking to our constituents, more importantly, listening to our constituents, hearing what's on their mind, and determining how we might do our job better. I sometimes, tongue-in-cheek, refer to Washington, D.C. as a forward operating base in hostile territory, but the truth is many of the most important battles that are fought in our country are fought out here on the floor of the United States Senate. But as we look ahead to next month, it's worth taking stock of where we've come in the first half of the 119th Congress, the first 6 months of President Trump's tenure as President of the United States, certainly in his second term, obviously. And it's been an amazing record of accomplishment if you look back at it. We've confirmed President Trump's cabinet at a record pace, no thanks to our Democratic colleagues who reflexively, you might even say mindlessly, have opposed each and every nominee of this president, with maybe one exception. That would be the Secretary of State, Senator Rubio. And they, in the process of obstructing all of these nominees and forcing us to burn valuable floor time by not agreeing to any voice votes or expedited consideration of non-controversial nominees, they have forced us to burn valuable floor time during which we might have taken up other important bipartisan matters. Nevertheless, we have done important things, unfortunately, alone on this side of the aisle without any support from our friends across the aisle. Things like extending the Trump tax cuts from 2017, making them permanent, addressing the looming debt ceiling to prevent a national default, and secured many other important wins for border security and law enforcement through the One Big Beautiful Bill. We also passed our first rescissions package, codifying many of the most important spending reforms identified by the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. But while these accomplishments are not insignificant, we are just getting started. As I mentioned, the Democratic colleagues here in the Senate have reflexively and mindlessly opposed President Trump's nominees. But we have confirmed 107 of them, while 147 lower level but critical nominees are still waiting to be confirmed by the Senate. 147. These include many ambassadors to key allies around the world that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee has voted out of committee. They are waiting for their day on the Senate floor. To date, Senate Democrats have allowed voice votes or given unanimous consent on exactly zero of President Trump's civilian nominees. Mr. President, this is the only time in recorded history that the minority party has refused to do so on any nominees at this point in the presidency. And it's shameful. It's inexcusable. They're not hurting Republicans. They're not hurting President Trump. They're hurting the American people, because these are people who will serve in critical positions that require Senate confirmation, not only here in the United States in the administration, but around the world representing the United States at embassies all across the planet. Senate Democrats' partisan obstruction is making our country less safe. It's making American foreign policy less effective, and it's ceding the field to our adversaries who have no problem putting their representatives in these countries which currently lack an American ambassador. I, for one, believe that if our Democratic colleagues do not relent on this needless and mindless obstruction, Senate Republicans will have to consider what additional steps we need to take in order to expedite this process. There's precedent for this. Back in 2017, when Neil Gorsuch was nominated for the United States Supreme Court, our Democratic colleagues refused to grant cloture or closing off debate by giving 60 votes for that purpose. It forced Republicans to change the Senate rules to lower that threshold from 60 down to 51, which had always been the longstanding tradition, even in spite of the possibility of requiring 60 votes. It simply had not been required previously. And when Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada was Majority Leader, the Democrats changed the threshold for cloture on all other federal judges from 60 to 51. And so in 2017, in order to break that logjam on Supreme Court nominees, Republicans returned the favor. I believe that some similar process by which we set a new precedent on the president's nominees may be necessary before we leave this chamber, before we leave the Senate in Washington, D.C. this month. The president must have his team in place. Again, our Democratic colleagues seem unwilling to accept the fact that President Trump actually won the election, receiving a mandate from the American people. Why else would they obstruct all of his nominees, force us to burn valuable floor time by not agreeing to any sort of expedited process, but forcing us to burn all this valuable floor time just to confirm 107 nominees and leave 147 waiting? Now, it's not fair to the American people, because these people are supposed to serve in important positions of responsibility on their behalf. It's not fair to President Trump, who's been denied his team. But it's also not fair to the people who agree to serve in these important Senate-confirmed positions, many of whom have had to sell their businesses, go through a rigorous ethics and legal background scrub, and so are simply waiting day after day after day. Will they or won't they? Will they or won't they vote to confirm me to this position, which for many of them, maybe all of them, is an honor of a lifetime? So we owe it to the American people. We owe it to President Trump. We owe it to these nominees who've volunteered to serve their country, to vote on these nominees without further delay. And there's more work to do, Mr. President. In addition to confirming President Trump's nominees, another task that awaits the Senate upon our return is the National Defense Authorization Act. This is the necessary authorization that Congress passes each year to support our men and women in the military, to make sure that we remain the preeminent military strength in the world. And as President Trump has said time and time again, to make sure that our main national security policy is peace through strength. We don't want to fight any unnecessary wars, but the best way to avoid fighting wars is through deterrence, and that comes with peace through strength. The Defense Authorization Bill is the main legislative vehicle for ensuring that our military has the resources they need to achieve the missions of today and to rise to the challenges of tomorrow. We are, I believe, living in the most dangerous world since World War II. And we must take seriously our obligation to authorize additional resources and support the men and women and the families who serve in the United States military. We passed the Defense Authorization Act for 63 consecutive years. And 2025 cannot be the year that we break that streak. The Senate Armed Services Committee, under the leadership of Chairman Wicker, has done an excellent job on a bipartisan basis. His committee has already completed the markup of the Defense Authorization Bill and filed it for consideration on the Senate floor. Last year, in contrast, the senator from New York, the Democratic leader, Senator Schumer, we did not see the Defense Authorization Act come to the floor until more than 2 months after the September 30th deadline. But I'm optimistic now with new leadership and with Republicans at the helm, we will pass the Defense Authorization Bill on a timely basis. Finally, in addition to confirming the President's nominees and ensuring our military readiness, Congress needs to fund the government. The end of the fiscal year is the end of September. But our Senate Democratic colleagues are already threatening not to work with us on funding the government, which perhaps is the most basic responsibility of Congress, threatening a harmful and unnecessary government shutdown. But it's clear that their reluctance to work with us to make sure that doesn't occur, that the risk of that happening is squarely on their shoulders. Now, their stated excuse is that they don't agree with some of the things that the Trump administration has been doing. Well, I'll remind our colleagues across the aisle that the American people are ultimately the ones who will have to pay the price if they continue to persist in delay tactics that lead to a government shutdown. It's simply mind-boggling to me that our Democratic colleagues would choose to impose a punitive shutdown on the American people as some sort of partisan payback for Republican efforts to put our country on a more sustainable fiscal path. Yes, we are trying to look for efficiency. We are trying to avoid waste, fraud, and abuse due to the efforts of the Department of Government Efficiency and other leaders in the Trump administration. But the fact remains our country is more than $36 trillion in debt. And the only way to ensure that our social safety net programs remain viable for generations to come and that we continue to be the preeminent military power in the world and maintain that deterrence that I spoke of a moment ago, the only way we can do that is by responsibly funding the government. And that has to happen between now and September the 30th. As the Senate winds down this week, and with a recess approaching, I'll remind our Democratic colleagues that our work is cut out for us upon our return. And we have important work to do yet before we leave, particularly with regard to this backlog of 147 nominees. We've had a productive and successful Senate, notwithstanding Democratic obstruction. But I look forward to doing even more, not only in the remaining time before we leave for the recess, but when we return from that recess. After all, we should not get bogged down by partisan battles that cause us to neglect our larger responsibility. We are here to represent the 350 million people that call this country home. And it falls to us on their behalf to do the job they sent us here to do, and not to engage in this mindless partisanship and increase the dysfunction and inefficiency of that government. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum. Unfortunately, the Democratic leader in this chamber, the senator from New York, is showing anything but that kind of leadership right now. He's demonstrated a complete unwillingness to tone down the rhetoric of his party or to make actually even good faith gestures toward good governance. In fact, this very week, he's demonstrating just how far he's willing to go to undermine basic governance in order to appease his radical base. He'd rather shut down the government than work across the aisle for the benefit of the American people. Senate Democrats have so far refused to even vote on a simple stopgap measure that will give us a little more time, about 9 weeks, to negotiate full-year government funding. If they do not relent in this partisan posturing, the result will be forever known as the Schumer shutdown. Now, you don't have to take it from me on what a government shutdown would mean for the American people. All we have to do is to read back to them the very words that the Senate Democrats have said in the past. In September of last year, when the shoe was on the other foot, Senator Schumer said, and I quote, "If the government shuts down, it will be average Americans who suffer the most." He also said, a government shutdown means seniors who rely on Social Security could be thrown into chaos. Is this even the same individual that's taking the position that's heading us toward a shutdown in the coming days? Last September, he went so far as to even say, keeping the government open will mean no poison pills or reckless partisan posturing. This is what he said just last year about a government shutdown. Where is that man today? Today, I'll tell you, he's engaging in a reckless partisan posturing while Republicans are proposing a responsible alternative. Again, this is not a vote on a permanent policy, but rather a stopgap measure to get us to a place where we need to be when it comes to the appropriations process. But he's willing to impose the very costs that he warned about on the American people and our seniors in order to score political points with his progressive radical base. The hypocrisy is obvious, and it's staggering. Madam President, it's a time for reckoning for our friends in the Democratic Party. They seem to not really know what they stand for these days, except opposition to each and everything that the majority party or the president wants, even when it's in their self-interest to do so. They need to look at themselves in the mirror and decide what and who they stand for. Are they going to be the party of violence and lawlessness and a degradation in public safety? Are they going to continue to this, what has been called frighteningly, an assassination culture? Will they continue down this mad path of taking the lives of those they disagree with and siding with the criminals over law enforcement personnel that are simply enforcing laws they have themselves helped write? And will they continue on prioritizing their ideology ahead of responsible governance? I often wonder how our friends on the other side of the aisle would react if they had to live in crime-ridden neighborhoods, overtaken by gangs and drug dealers, and they had to wait 20 or 30 minutes before any police officer responded to their calls for help after an assault or a robbery. How would they feel? Well, I'm quite sure, I'm confident that they would change their tune. And just like current residents in blue cities who've had to suffer under the weight of failed Democratic soft-on-crime policing policies, they would gladly welcome additional police protection and efforts to clean up and stabilize their neighborhoods. But sadly, most Democrats, at least so far, here in Washington, D.C., have appeared to be completely tone deaf and rarely hear the true voices of the people whose lives they assume they represent, people living in these inner cities. Well, regardless of what Democrats decide to stand for, Republicans will continue to be the party that respects free and open discussion of ideas. And we will continue to support our law enforcement officers, men and women, who risk their lives day in and day out so that Texans and all Americans can sleep soundly in their beds. And we'll continue to be the party that opposes reckless partisan tactics that put ideology ahead of the needs of the American people. Republicans have made it clear under President Trump that we will enforce the rule of law. That is non-negotiable. So it's no surprise that the American people overwhelmingly voted for Republican leadership last November. If Democrats continue to head down this path of violence and division, they should not be surprised if they continue to experience the same outcome at the ballot box in the upcoming midterms as they did last November in the general election. Madam President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Texas.
Madam President, are we on a quorum call?
We are not.
Madam President, it's been 6 days since Senate Democrats have shut down the federal government. They did that by blocking a clean continuing resolution, as it's called around here, a stopgap spending bill that would take us to November the 21st to provide enough time to try to work out appropriations bills for full year funding, which are highly preferable to simply operating on autopilot as a continuing resolution would do. And this has already passed the House of Representatives. So all we need to do to reopen the government is for five Democrats to join 3 other Democrats and Republicans to vote to reopen the government, not forever, but for the next 9 weeks or so. Let's not forget that it was partisan antics on their part that have brought us where we are today. we've now voted not just once, but 4 times on the House-passed clean government funding bill. While 3 Democrats have seen the light, as I said earlier, and have joined Republicans in voting for a clean continuing resolution, they have routinely done this in the past. When President Biden was in office, when Chuck Schumer was the majority leader, we voted for, I think, 13 separate continuing resolutions. But so far, they've refused to do so out of pure spite and partisanship. Government shutdowns have unfortunately become far too common in Washington, but I think it's important to take a minute to consider the impacts, the real-world impact on our constituents back home. Since Texas is obviously one of the largest states in the country, it will suffer an outsized impact. The Lone Star State is home to about 130,000 federal civilian employees. This number includes 33,000 who work with the Veterans Health Administration. These are the folks who serve our veterans, who we are duty-bound and obligated, morally obligated to support. But 33,000 of them will be negatively impacted by this shutdown, already have been. Almost 18,000 of these employees of these total number, work for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. These are the folks that stop illegal drugs from entering in the country and make sure that illegal aliens don't make their way into the country, as we've seen during the last 4 years. Close to 6,000 Texans work for the Transportation Security Administration, the folks that you encounter at airports and various different ports that help manage the flow of travelers going to and from security screenings before they board flights. Finally, the Lyndon B. Johnson Space Center in Texas has 3,000 employees, but is expected to furlough about 70% of them due to the lapse in federal funding. What happens to these federal employees during a government shutdown? Well, the most dramatic thing that happens to them is they don't get paid. Even those that are deemed essential and who have to work, they work without pay, just as those who are furloughed work without pay. Now, before I came to the floor, I looked up a statistic, and I think it sounds about right, but 6 out of 10 Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And while it may be okay for members of Congress, particularly wealthy members of Congress who don't have to worry about living paycheck to paycheck, to miss a paycheck, it's catastrophic to many, many Americans who live paycheck to paycheck, who don't have adequate savings to help them weather a government shutdown. And while each of these categories receive back pay once the government's reopened, they cannot receive a paycheck during the shutdown. This is extraordinarily unfair to these government employees who, through no fault of their own, are being denied the pay that they have earned. Now, this will have a particularly serious impact on our military and Department of Homeland Security personnel, many of whom have been designated as accepted, or we used to say some were essential employees, but they have to stay on the job, in other words, but they don't get paid either. Texas has 15 active duty military installations where personnel are required to continue reporting for duty throughout the shutdown. These active duty personnel will not be paid again until a final funding deal is reached. And right now, we don't know how long this is going to go on. I know most of us come to the floor and express our gratitude, our profound gratitude to our men and women in uniform and their families that serve our country and keep us safe. But this strikes me as a very bad way to say thank you to them by saying, yes, you have to continue to work, but no, you're not going to be paid. So Senate Democrats apparently have made that calculation. This is how they thank them: by cutting off their pay, denying them their livelihood, and holding them hostage over petty partisan demands. In addition to active duty military personnel, I mentioned Customs and Border Protection. All of them are expected to continue reporting for duty day in and day out during the government shutdown. Our Border Patrol agents, who bore the brunt of Biden's open border policies, working hundreds of hours in some of the harshest of conditions, and have processed millions of illegal aliens flooding into the United States courtesy of President Biden. Now we're telling them, or at least Senate Democrats are telling them, you're not going to get paid. This is how they have chosen to reward these patriotic men and women who keep our borders secure, by shutting down the government and denying them their paycheck. And why do Senate Democrats think this is so important? Well, they've told us what their demands are, what the ransom that they are demanding. They want us to wipe out a $50 billion rural hospital stabilization fund that was part of the One Big Beautiful Bill. Many of us represent rural states that have large rural areas, and access to health care is a big problem. And we had tried to address that problem by providing a significant fund, this Rural Hospital Stabilization Fund, to help address those concerns. But Democrats want to take that away. We also said in the One Big Beautiful Bill, no money can go to provide health care for illegal aliens. Access to free government services is one of the magnets that draw people to come to our country in the first place. This is one of the so-called pull factors that the Border Patrol talks about. And we said no more free health care for illegal aliens, which is a magnet for people to enter the country the wrong way, not the right way. And Democrats want to restore that free health care to illegal aliens as part of their demands for reopening the government. Madam President, this is simply unconscionable, but it is also profoundly dumb. Shut down the government solves nothing. We've seen this movie before, and what happens when you reopen the government, the same problem, the same issues that caused you to shut down the government are there staring you in the face. So these shutdowns solve nothing. I don't know how Senate Democrats can continue voting against a clean government funding bill like they themselves have previously supported on a routine basis, knowing that the men and women who keep them and us safe are working for free, without a paycheck, for no other reason than that Senate Democrats refuse to give up on their partisan pipe dreams. FEMA employees, Federal Emergency Management Agency, who are first responders in a case of natural disaster, are also expected to continue to be working without paid during hurricane season, no less. In addition to law enforcement and emergency personnel, a government shutdown affects all Americans one way or the other. It affects travel, it affects access to public lands. TSA workers and air traffic controllers have to keep working. And these are the people that make sure our airlines operate safely and on time. But they have to work without pay. The hiring and training of any new air traffic controllers, which we know is a real problem and an important issue, all that will stop during the time the federal government shut down. No new hiring of new personnel to help make our air traffic safe. All of this because Senate Democrats can't work in a bipartisan manner to keep government open even for a few weeks. The government shutdown also impacts our national parks and federal lands. Texas boasts 3.2 million acres of federally operated public lands, including Big Bend National Park, Guadalupe Mountains National Park, and Padre Island National Seashore. National parks face a partial shutdown, meaning that some areas, such as open-air sites, will remain open to the public, but buildings that require staffing, like museums, will have to close. Madam President, my constituents, roughly 32 million Americans, like all Americans, have to pay the price because of this completely unnecessary government shutdown and the outrageous demands Democrats are making to reopen. All of this lies squarely at their feet. You know, I was reflecting over the weekend after the last time we voted to reopen the government and Democrats voted no, how this must reflect on the United States in the eyes of the world. You know, I think most countries, most people around the world look at the United States as sort of that city on the hill, the place where they would like to live or at least visit, because we have the largest, most successfully functioning democracy in the world, with high standards of living, the opportunity for people to work hard, provide for their family, start a business, achieve their dreams. It is profoundly embarrassing, I think it should be embarrassing, to all members of Congress that we simply cannot get our act together enough to fund the government for the next few weeks while these negotiations over long-term appropriations bills are occurring. This kind of dysfunction is completely unworthy of what has been known, what has used to be known as the world's greatest deliberative body. The unfortunate reality is it doesn't have to be this way. Many of our Democratic friends have from time to time talked about various things being a threat to democracy. Well, being unable to pass a bill to fund the government to keep the lights on and keep people, government employees paid, that strikes me as a threat to our democracy. Senate Democrats have long preached the virtues of bipartisanship, especially when it comes to avoiding government shutdowns. And in the past, they've wagged their finger. We've seen it all on social media and on cable TV. They've said shutdowns are idiocy. That's what the Democratic leader said on TV years ago when the shoe was on the other foot. He said it's idiocy. Well, I agree with him. It was idiocy then, and it's idiocy now. The American people may not understand the ins and outs of what goes on here, but what they can smell from a mile away is hypocrisy. And that's all this is, sheer hypocrisy. All our colleagues need to do when we vote here shortly is to vote for a clean, continuing resolution. And all of this can be reversed. And we can get back to the working together to try to solve some of the issues that I know they care about as well. We all care about access to health care. And that's one of the items that we have to address certainly before the end of the year with the expiring of certain provisions, certain subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. And we're happy to have that conversation. And we will have that conversation, but not while the government shut down. So the good news is, well, let me back up and say the bad news is government shut down. The good news is that can end today, this afternoon. Democrats have an opportunity to vote with Republicans to pass a clean continuing resolution, as they have at many times in the past. So I hope we can all join arms and say, let's put an end to this nonsense and pass this legislation on what will now be the fifth opportunity. The American people are counting on us, and we shouldn't let them down. Madam President, I yield the floor. Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
President, are we in a quorum call?
We're not.
After more than 2 years of bloodshed, 20 living hostages, and the remains of at least 7 deceased hostages were recently returned to their families in Israel by Hamas. Videos of the tearful reunions circulating on social media show the immense joy and relief felt by the families who have been suffering through the unthinkable, and wondering if they will ever see their loved ones again. Behind all this extraordinary story is the leadership of President Trump in negotiating an end to this war that's lasted 2 years. President Trump has rightly gained praise from some of the most unexpected critics, like Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. All of these people are correctly acknowledging what supporters of President Trump have known for a long time. He is truly a master of the art of the deal. I can't think of a single president who, through a combination of carrots and sticks, could have accomplished something like this before, but President Trump has, and he deserves the credit. But of course, for this conflict to be truly over, each and every one of the conditions laid out in President Trump's 20-point peace deal must be implemented by both sides. And that's where the trouble really begins. We cannot allow a terrorist organization like Hamas to pull the wool over our eyes or to act like this is any normal sort of negotiation between two parties acting in good faith. Hamas must keep up its end of the bargain on this and other terms for the deal to actually work. We've already seen how Hamas has violated the peace agreement, as they have not yet returned the remaining bodies of 20 additional hostages who are presumed dead, including 2 American citizens, so that their families can properly grieve and bury their loved ones. Yesterday, Hamas, despite this peace deal, violently sought to reassert its control over Gaza from rival Palestinian groups. This included Hamas dragging several men from their families and executing them in broad daylight. Hamas has been rightfully described as a death cult. Their blatant regard for human life is the reason the Palestinian people have undergone so much suffering over the last 2 years in Gaza. I know some would like to blame Israel and the Israeli Defense Force and Prime Minister Netanyahu, but the reason for the humanitarian disaster that has been Gaza for the last 2 years is because of Hamas. If they hadn't executed 1,200 or so Israeli citizens on October the 7th, 2 years ago, none of this would have occurred. Of course, establishing an agreement that depends on the goodwill of Hamas is going to be an enormous challenge. And it can't be a matter of faith that they will act as any negotiating partner in good faith would be presumed to act. Over the last 24 hours, the importance of establishing a multinational security force in Gaza to replace Hamas has become increasingly clear. Hamas cannot remain in control if we are to have peace. But the return of the 20 living hostages is no small feat, and it's something to be celebrated. And if President Trump is successful in ultimately bringing a lasting peace to the region, it will be one of the most significant diplomatic and foreign policy accomplishments in memory. Mr. President, on another matter, it's now been 15 days since Senate Democrats have shut down the federal government. They did that by blocking a short-term spending provision that would have taken us up until November the 21st. In other words, roughly 9 weeks from the beginning of the continuing resolution. Republicans have given Democrats multiple opportunities to end this mess by holding a number of votes on the House-passed continuing resolution. As the majority leader, Senator Thune, has pointed out numerous times, we're not asking for any major policy changes. All we're asking is to keep the lights on and to keep federal government employees paid during this period of time while we work out longer-term appropriations bills by the November the 21st deadline. But every single time we've given Democrats opportunity to do the right thing, only 3 of them have voted to reopen the government. You know, talking to my constituents back home, it's hard to explain what's going on here. They understand the stupidity of a government shutdown. Experience has shown that the same problems that cause a shutdown in the first place are there staring you in the face when the government is reopened. So it accomplishes nothing, except maybe as performance art. And if you think about it, that's really what this is. Our Democratic colleagues are afraid to act in a reasonable and logical manner and keep the government open while we negotiate longer-term appropriations bills and take up the issue of health care subsidies that expire at the end of this calendar year. In a normal world, that's what we would be doing now, but we can't do any of that during the government shutdown. Federal employees are now beginning to miss their paychecks, which will have consequences that reverberate throughout the country. 1 in 6 Americans lives paycheck to paycheck. So it may not be a big deal to wealthy senators on the Democratic side who don't have to worry about paying the bills paycheck to paycheck, but it does matter to many, many Americans because it means they may not be able to pay their rent. They may not be able to buy groceries for their family or pay their utility bills because they're not receiving a paycheck. Some people may be thinking, well, it's only government employees that are going to be affected. And everybody knows the federal government's big and bloated and could stand a diet. But it's not simply the case that these government employees will be the only ones affected. There are going to be a number of downstream effects of this Democrat-induced shutdown that have consequences for everybody. First of all, I have to tell you, it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing that the greatest country in the world and the people who are elected to represent 330 million Americans can't get their act together and can't figure this out. It is beyond dumb. It makes no sense at all, except as a matter of self-serving political gesturing and the sort of performance art that I mentioned a moment ago, trying to demonstrate to your political base, yeah, we're fighting. Well, this isn't fighting. Fighting is keeping the government open, having debates, having votes, trying to persuade people to your point of view. That's what political fighting is. It's not taking your ball and going home. One issue affecting the whole country, federal workers and private sector employees alike, is the way this shutdown is disturbing airplane flights. My flight coming back from Austin this past weekend was delayed by such a disruption. Wasn't that big a deal to me, obviously, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who's experienced this, and more importantly than the fact that senators are experiencing, our constituents, the people we represent, the people we owe our jobs to. They're the ones that are suffering inconvenience. Transportation security agents and air traffic controllers are among the federal workers deemed essential during a government shutdown, which means they have to work, but they're not being paid. And that's a pretty difficult situation for many of these folks to be in. As I said, some of them can't afford child care, to buy groceries, to pay the rent, to pay utilities. This is a true hardship for many of these Americans. This has resulted in many of these essential employees calling in sick in order to pick up shift work to make ends meet. Additionally, those who are showing up are having to work under increased stress, longer hours, and short-staffed working environment. On top of this, they are carrying the burden of unknowing when they're ever going to get paid. Now, we know that under the law, these employees will eventually be reimbursed for their missed salary, but that doesn't do a lot to put food on the table right now, or pay the rent, or to pay utility bills now. As the president of the National Air Traffic Controllers put it, it is completely unfair that an air traffic controller, the one who makes sure our airline flights are safe, it's completely unfair that an air traffic controller is the one that holds the burden of see how long you can hang in there in order to allow this political process to work out. The president of a local chapter, the American Federation of Government Employees in Dallas, Fort Worth, said regarding the shutdown, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions coming from the field. They don't know how long this is going to last. I don't know how long it's going to last either. But the problem is that it only gets worse the longer this shutdown goes on. Just in terms of airline flights, we've seen hundreds canceled since the shutdown began, and thousands more have been delayed, which means more and more Americans' daily routines are being upended as a result of this irrational and truly stupid government shutdown. Are seeing some of the worst delays. Last Tuesday, both the George W. Bush Intercontinental Airport and Hobby Airport in Houston were at risk of ground stops because of staffing shortages. Love Field in Dallas was also experiencing delays, but this isn't just affecting the state of Texas. Airports around the country are experiencing delays in order to avoid dangerous potential air flights and ground activity associated with short staffing. The Federal Aviation Administration is also reporting staffing problems in Boston, Nashville, Chicago, and Philadelphia, as well as Burbank, California, Newark, New Jersey, and Denver, Colorado. Some analysts have speculated that the disruptions could continue to cause problems during the upcoming travel holiday, Thanksgiving, and into Christmas. For many of us here in the Senate, it has become an unwelcome tradition each year to have our Thanksgiving and Christmas celebrations with our families upset in order to perform our responsibilities. That doesn't just affect members of the Senate and the House, but also the able staff that make our work possible. Of course, what this tradition is really a sign of dysfunction. It's embarrassing. It should be embarrassing. If we did our jobs properly and passed our appropriations bills on time, we would not have to impose the burdens of all this on other people, our constituents and our staff. It is really not rational that Senate Democrats should impose this burden on the entire country in order to try to appease the more radical elements of their political base, which is really what this is all about. They're afraid to agree to something reasonable and rational and short-term because they know that they're likely to be criticized by their political base, the more radical elements in the Democratic base. Well, don't take my word for it. Minority Leader Schumer has made it clear that he is willing to impose almost any cost on ordinary Americans in order to try to appease his radical progressive base. In one of the more telling quotes, he admitted to Punchbowl News last week that this was all about politics when he said, quote, "Every day gets better for us." Really? Well, by us, he doesn't mean the American people. He must mean people like him who are afraid to say no to their radical base in order to perform the most basic functions of government. Plus the fact it's not true. Is every day really getting better? Or is it more and more embarrassing? Is it having more and more of a ripple effect on people who are innocent of any wrongdoing? They just happen to be affected. I think if the Democratic leader were to ask the Transportation Security Administration workers who are working overtime without pay, or the air traffic controllers who are wondering when, if ever, they will receive their next paycheck, who are also working without pay, or the mothers and fathers, the federal employees, who are wondering if they're able to enjoy the holidays with their children and their extended families because of travel disruption, or maybe just because financially they won't be able to make ends meet. But the truth is that Senate Democrats care less about federal workers and the rest of the country than they do about appeasing their radical base. Senator Schumer has made it clear that it was his plan all along to make the American people pay the price in order to achieve his political goals when he said, quote, "We've thought about this long in advance." So this wasn't an accident. This wasn't sort of a surprising occurrence. This was planned all along by Senator Schumer, the Democratic leader, which makes it all that much more egregious. Well, I sincerely hope, for the sake of Texans and Americans all across the country, that Senate Democrats will have a change of heart. I hope that someday soon, maybe today, Senate Democrats will set aside the demands of their radical base and simply vote to put an end to this ridiculous government shutdown that serves no one's interest except perhaps their own narrow political interests. We need to pass that short-term continuing resolution that will only take us to November the 21st. And then I imagine we're going to have this discussion all over again, which is just further evidence of the dysfunction here in the Senate and in the Congress these days, mainly because our Senate Democrats and House Democrats are so opposed to President Trump and his policies. And they feel like they need to be shown to fight and to push back against President Trump. But they're not hurting President Trump. He's doing just fine. He's making incredible peace deals in the Middle East and hopefully other places around the world like Ukraine. What they're doing is hurting their own constituents, and they're causing people to doubt whether their government can actually function the way it's supposed to. So I hope, given the opportunity to vote here shortly on another short-term continuing resolution, a stopgap spending bill that will only take us to November the 21st, that we get 5 more Democrats join the 3 who've already voted to reopen the government so that we can put an end to this foolishness. Because every day does not get better for the American people, even if it gets better politically to save Senator Schumer's skin. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Clerk, call the roll.